Namaste. Good evening from India. I am Dr. Shruti Mahapatra, and I am the Vice Chair of CDPF, Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. And we are an accredited organization with the Commonwealth, and we represent 450 million people with disabilities spread across 56 countries of the Commonwealth. There are already 50 organizations countries which have joined the CDPF. I'm here to welcome all of you and also to congratulate you to be joining the first module of the CDPF Disabled Youth Leadership course. We are running this course from now to the end of March 2024. This is our contribution to the Commonwealth Year of Youth. There are 150 lucky youths who have been selected to join this course because you have the passion, you have the interest to become leaders, young leaders of the disabled people's movement and take it forward. We have developed this course because we are an umbrella organization and we represent over 90 DPOs. And what are DPOs? Disabled People's Organizations across 50 Commonwealth countries. And we are aware of the age gap between the present leadership and 60% of the Commonwealth population, which is below the age of 30. We will be holding regular seminars. We will be conducting discussions with the different leaders of these organizations for them to understand and make their DPOs more representative. We want to understand the needs and the aspirations of the youth and for them to lead this movement ahead. CDPF's main mission, its priority, is to implement the CRPD, also called the UNCRPD, United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have developed this course to ensure that you understand what are the needs, aspirations of the disabled and how they can not just become equal citizens, but from equality, we are able together to move ahead to equity so that we live with dignity on planet Earth. Why do we call ourselves disabled people? Is a question that might arise in your mind when the United Nations uses the word people with disabilities or persons with disabilities, because of the evolution of the social model of disability. In the 19th and the 20th century, the medical model was very prevalent. It was thought a person's disability, a person's medical conditions and impairments were the cause of their exclusion, were the cause of their being separated from the mainstream and not being able to achieve a lot. But it was later, when the social model of disability arose, people understood, society understood that it is not our impairment, rather the barriers that are created in the society, the attitudinal barriers, physical barriers, communication barriers. These are the barriers which hinder our inclusion. And we as a group of people, we also belong to just one common group, regardless of which impairment we have. Hence, we prefer to be called disabled people rather than people with disabilities. However, I would like all of you to remember, whenever we are discussing the United Nations Convention, the CRPD, we will keep using the terms person with disabilities or people with disabilities. You see, the core of the module. So what is this module? What is this module about fundamental shift in thinking? So the core to this module is to understand the fundamental shift in thinking about disabled people that is represented in the transition from the individual, medical, to the social model and the human rights view. As United Nations Department of Social and Economic Affairs puts it, soon after the convention was adopted in 2006, they say, the convention follows decades of work done by the United Nations to change attitudes and approaches to persons with disabilities. It takes a new height. The movement from viewing persons with disabilities as objects of charity, medical treatment, and social protection towards viewing persons with disabilities as subjects with their own rights, who are capable of claiming those rights and taking decisions about their lives based on free and informed consent, as well as being active members of the society. For me, in India, this paradigm shift means a lot of things, See, when in the year 1995, when in India we got our first law, Persons with Disabilities Act, it was called PWD Act 1995, it was more of a charity-oriented thing. It had no space for establishing rights. It only talked about how people can be protected, how they can be taken care of. And the other thing that this law had was 7 identified disabilities, a very closed and confined term, and did not look at the functional challenges that the different groups face. But because of the paradigm shift in 2016, the new law that India got, because I would like all of you to know that India was one of the first countries to ratify this in the year 2007. We signed in 2006 and we ratified it in the year 2007. From then on, a huge movement, civil rights movement by a large number of disabled people, parents of children who had disability, and experts who have been working in this field, they worked together to tell the government that please do not go for 500 and 1,000 amendments. Rather, let's have a new law. So that's how the 1995 Act was discarded and the new law. And what does this new law do for me? The new law, it clearly stated, forget about taking care, forget about charity. The right of every person with disability is equal to the right of any person in India. Any citizen of India has the same rights. And it expanded the definition of disability. Taking from the UNCRPD preamble, it said that disability cannot be a fixed thing. It's a dynamic concept and it evolves. And this evolution happens when the functional challenges, they meet with physical barriers, attitudinal barriers, and the new technologies, the new innovations, and the new thought process that arise in the horizon. So it expanded the number of scheduled disabilities from 7 to 21, and at the same time kept an open clause. Say, if you feel that a particular disability, a particular condition, medical condition, needs to be represented as a disability because people are not patients, they are human beings, then please provide sufficient evidence to the government and government will declare it as a new disability. So this was a huge scope that the new human rights law provided. The second aspect of this new law, which personally I really admire a lot and I appreciate also the steps taken by Government of India in this regard, is accessibility. If we go through the new law in India, we will find reference to accessibility 48 times in the law, whereas the old law only talked about it in few sentences and restricted it mostly to physical or structural barriers. But this new law talks about not just physical, infrastructural, and communication barriers. It focuses on governance barriers, organizational barriers, procedural barriers, and a lot of other such barriers which expand the scope of functioning of the government. And as a person with high spinal cord injury, today I can tell you that travel, stay, even schools, colleges, and universities, public spaces are becoming very accessible. And the most recent court decision talks about entry into temples and religious places which were completely taboo in India. Now we have laws, now we have some judgments from the superior courts, and those bastions are also opening up. Another thing is education. For me, as a person with disability, as a disabled woman, I believe education is the key to success. If you are educated, you will find your way out. And education was beyond the reach of children who had disability in India. Schools were far off, teachers were not well trained, there was no material, there were no audio books or books in braille, books in large font, and there were no teachers who could prepare teaching learning material in this thing. Students from more than 2 kilometers, they did not feel like coming to the schools in the villages because toilets were never accessible. And one of the characteristics, very common in most of the places where the cow catches near the gates, which made it extremely difficult for those with walkers and those on wheelchairs, those with prosthetic limbs to walk and enter into the schools. Now with the new law, with the CRPD mandate, we have a new education policy 2020, which is very, very extensive. You access, you will generate questions, you will think about it, you will try to understand, you will go into several discussions, and all your queries and concerns that you have, it will be addressed in your monthly live online regional meetings where you will have tutors and experts to clarify all your doubts. I hope you will make the best use of your training, and when you come back and when we look at your presentation, when we look at your understanding, your papers, we will be able to understand the struggles that you face at home and how you have fought to ensure the removal of all these barriers, how you have been able to make a change in the quality of living of disabled people in your home state. Thank you very much for listening to me. And now I hand over this session to our General Secretary, Mr. Richard Reiser. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Shruti. I'd like to also welcome everybody on the course. You'll watch this video at different times, and then you'll come together in your groups later in this month. So the paradigm shift in the thinking about disabled people. If you think of two sides of a table, on one side is the individual, the traditional, the medical model, and on the other side is the social model, human rights model. And there are 10 things, I'm sure you could come up with others, 10 big differences. So on the individual model side, the disabled person is seen as an object, whereas on the social model side, they're empowered and they have collective strength. On the individual side, impairment is seen as an individual issue, whereas on the social model side, disablement is a social and human rights issue. On the individual side, we're not valued, whereas on the social human rights model, we're all disabled people are valued and we are owners of our own human rights. On the medical or individual side, impairments are assessed and labeled. On the social model side, the self-identification of barriers and solutions. And on the fifth one, on the individual side, we're seen as not capable of contributing to society, whereas on the social side, we contribute with support and reasonable accommodations. On the one of the outcomes of a big outcome on the individual side is segregation, separation, and special educational needs or special needs. On the other side is inclusion and involvement in all aspects of society. On the individual side, our emotional needs are put on hold while our differences are focused on, whereas on the human rights social side, the relationships are nurtured. The next bit is, sorry. Medical treatments and deficit thinking dominate our lives on the individual side, whereas our strengths and needs are defined by ourselves and others. On the individual side, it's individual action, whereas on the social human rights side, it's collective action. So as a result of this, the world stays the same on this individual or medical side, whereas on the social human rights side, the world evolves. And really, we can characterize this on the one side, victimhood. On the other side, we're challenging an active process of challenging the oppression of disablement. So now I'd like to introduce our first film clip. We're going to have various clips from members of our executive. The first one is going to be Kerry-Ann Eiffel, who is our other vice president from Barbados and the Caribbean. And she's going to be talking about the importance of this shift for everybody.
Moving from the medical/individual approach to disabilities towards a social human rights model of viewing our impairments. We in the community, we in the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, we say disabled person. Why is that? We say it because all of us, we live with our impairments, but it's not our impairments that create the barriers. It is society that does so. It's not because you are in a wheelchair that stops you from entering a building. It's because there's no accessible entry point. It's not because you're blind that you cannot read the newspaper. It is because they do not provide it in an accessible format. It also means that society needs to consult. We're not objects. We're not handbags to be handed over. We're not things with problems. We're people, objects, living with living with an impairment. We live with it because that is who we are. But we direct, guide, and definitely contribute to our society. We work to achieve common goals. Picture, if you will, a world where everyone is sitting together, talking, exchanging ideas, communicating, participating in social activities, political activities, cheering on their sports teams. The teams are made up of persons with diverse representations, people living with all kinds of impairments, people without any visible impairments, and people without impairments at all. But we're all striving towards the same goal, achieving a better world for everyone. That is the social human rights model where we are consulted and involved in discussing. We live with our impairments, and because of that, yes, we may need a cane, or we may need wheelchair, we may need alternative communication, we may need all kinds of other support mechanisms to fully be a part of society. But inclusion means that all persons, irregardless of our impairments or lack thereof, whether we are persons or family members of persons with living with their disability, disabled persons, where we can we'll never remove the impairment, but we can remove the barriers that prevent us from participating in communities. That is what we in CDPF are working towards, a world free of barriers, a world where we're no longer disabled persons, but just persons.
So thank you very much, Kerry-Ann. But how did we get to this transformative thinking? And we have to go right back, really, to look at traditional ways of thinking. Now, impairment, which is our loss of function, has always been with us as human beings. As long as there have been human beings, there's been impairment. There are differences in our genes, which we can't do very much about. There are differences in our response to diseases, some of which leave us permanently impaired, There are environmental catastrophes such as fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, typhoons, you name it, or just simple accidents in the home, wars, which cause a great deal of impairment, and motor accidents and other such things. And indeed, our emotional environment also creates insecurities and mental health issues, which lead to having long-term impairment. So these have always been with us. The real issue is the way that these have been interpreted. These were usually negative, resulting in stigma, taboos, negative attitudes, and stereotypes, which really still persist in many cultures and in the media, which have recycled these old ideas, which are just not accurate, but which a lot of people still think. So, for example, people were thought to be disabled because they or their parents had done something wrong, and because all-powerful gods or deities or fate had made them disabled, karma or sin. This is perhaps one of the most dominant views, and of course there is no basis for this at all. Disabled people were often subject to inhuman treatment, being seen as bringing shame on their family. They were locked away. Euthanasia, which was the practice of exterminating babies, was widely practiced throughout the world for a long period. When disabled babies were born into the world, the children often were abandoned, and if they survived, they relied on begging. Viewed as not fully human or possessed by evil spirits. Ridicule, for instance, court jesters or freak shows, clowns, and a lot of disabled people had to earn their living like this. Particularly certain impairment groups were stereotyped, like short people or people with learning difficulties. Henry VIII, for instance, had a whole group of jesters, as he called them, living at his court, and he believed that they had a true understanding of what was going on, so he had a direct line to God, so they would always tell you the truth. And there's evidence of quite a lot of money being paid for them to live at Hampton Court throughout his rule. Going back beyond that, Greek society, people like Aristotle and Plato argued for the exposure of disabled babies. Perhaps this was because they were the Greek city-states depended on warriors to capture other people's land and therefore needed people with martial skills. The Bible itself, both in the Old Testament, which puts restrictions on who can be a priest, and the New Testament about how to cure penitent sinners with miracles and so on, have more than 40 references to disability, usually seen as from a negative point of view, though you can have be pardoned, if you like, by being a good follower of the religion. Shakespeare's Richard III, a well-known play about a disabled king who was tried to kill his way to the throne, was largely based on Tudor propaganda rather than the facts. And Shakespeare gave him 3 different impairments: a humpback or scoliosis, a withered leg, and a lame arm. 2 of these have proved not to be the case, because a few years ago they found his body, which they proved by DNA testing, in a Leicestershire car park, and they found that he only had the scoliosis. He didn't have the other 2 things. These were added in by the Tudors as propaganda because he was an evil king. They wanted to make sure people didn't understand that they had usurped his throne. A wider use of this was in the witch hunts instigated by the church, the organized church across Europe from 1480 to 1680, as trade capitalism began to challenge the power of the church across Europe. We had witch hunts where women, particularly women with impairments, were blamed for whatever was going on and were put to death or put on the ducking stool. If they drowned, they were innocent. If they came to the surface, they were guilty and therefore would be hung. It's estimated 8 million, largely women and quite a lot disabled women, were executed across Europe at this time. Applications of the false science of eugenics to disabled people in the 19th and 20th century, when Darwin's theory of natural selection was wrongly used to say that there were certain groups of human beings who would reduce the gene pool and needed to be stopped from breeding and got rid of. This was very strong in the United States and England. in the end, in the United States, 37 states banned marriages of various people. Immigration to the United States of disabled people was banned. And this idea was taken up by the Nazis, and Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf writes about this, thanks to British and American social science, and led to the beginnings of the final solution for not only 6 million Jewish people, but over 1 million disabled people who were in fact the guinea pigs that these mass killing methods were tried out on. The last freak show only ended in Coney Island in 2001. Give an example from Africa. Across much of sub-Saharan Africa, albinism is treated as people with this condition as second-class citizens. People who inherit this gene have low pigment or melanin in their skin, and it also affects their eyesight. Folklore and tribal customs, reinforced by witch doctors, has labeled albinos as ghost people, or often believed to because of their mother. People with albinism are regularly singled out and subject to torture, cruel and inhuman, degrading treatment, or killing because of harmful practice related to accusations of witchcraft. In 29 African countries, people with albinism are ritually banished, attacked, and accused of witchcraft. Their graves are often robbed because their bones are seen as having great value. These human rights violations occur due to the dehumanizing myths and beliefs that people with albinism and their body parts can bring good luck and wealth. The African Albinism Network, a DPO, has organized people with albinism across Africa, and they've had some success, particularly with the Republic of Kenya, which hadn't been shared its share of killing and abuse. But in the last 10 years, there's been an agreement made with the Kenyan government that they will approach this with swift and strategic effective action, community education, and building up the resourcefulness and the response of people with albinism and challenging the views in the community. And this has led to there now being no killings in the last few years in Kenya. And in 22, this model is now being spread to other parts of the country. Can we now go to the second clip, please? Thank you.
So I think this is one of the things why as CDPF, we call ourselves disabled people, because discrimination and stigma is one of the barriers or the things that make us disabled. So as you have rightly said, in Africa and even in Malawi, we disabled people are really struggling to create more awareness for people to understand some of the cultural and the wrong beliefs that they have towards disabled people. For example, in Malawi, you find in other areas, in the rural areas, where people believe that if a woman is disabled, then you have a child who is also disabled. So if a woman is deaf, then their child will also be deaf or blind. So there are these cultural beliefs that really create unnecessary barriers for disabled people to enjoy their full human rights. And I think as the DPOs, we have a very greater role to play. One is creating more awareness around the rights of disabled people, because we are operating from a human rights perspective. So we are not going on the table to beg, rather we are going there to demand our rights and be equal participants or equal citizens of enjoying those rights. So creating awareness is very crucial. And governments also funding to DPOs is very important to allow DPOs to exercise their role of advocating for their rights. And I also think that it is important for disabled people, DPOs, to be part of the processes of developing and reviewing disability rights instruments, including laws and policies that are being formulated in their respective countries. But also as disabled people, we have to be exemplary. So when we have been given an opportunity to serve the people, we have to demonstrate that we have that ability so that we create opportunities for more people with, for more disabled people.
So thank you very much, Skada. I should have said that Skada Louis is our treasurer, and she's also the chair of the Malawi Human Rights Commission and is a very experienced disabled activist. And we're very pleased to have her views as part of what we're putting forward here. So going on, thinking of notions of disabled people in your culture and how you argue against them. So an activity to take away from this film, the first one I'm giving you, is think of notions about disabled people in your culture, the sorts of traditional views we've been talking about, make a list of them, and then develop some arguments that you would use to show people that these are false arguments and they should change their view. So the second area that we want to look at, which is related to the traditional view, is perhaps something called the charity view of disability. Now, obviously, that harsh treatment that people have had that we talked about, and there were lots of examples there were many people of goodwill who thought, well, this isn't right. These people shouldn't be treated this badly, and let's create asylum, let's create places for them to go so they are not treated so badly. And these charitable purposes got set up. And in fact, there are still charities in most Commonwealth countries that you have to have charitable aims to do it. But we in the disability movement have reacted against that. And we say, no, what we want are rights, not charity. We want full welfare provision from the state. We want the rights that are contained now in the UN CRPD, we'll talk about in a minute. And we want those. We don't want charity, because to be charity, people are encouraged to have pity for us, to feel sorry for us. And in a way, this is a way of actually thinking of us as other and not the same. Suitable cases for charity. No, we are rights bearers and we are entitled to those. But, you know, in the wake of the adoption of the UN CRPD in 2006, a new generation of almost carpetbaggers, these were people who moved into the south of the United States after slavery was got rid of to try and make a quick buck. Now, I'm not saying that many of the charities and international NGOs that have moved in to this area are exactly like that, but there is an element of that they are getting in on the act. And what we say is nothing about us without us. We don't need necessarily to have all these non-governmental and charity organizations deciding what should happen for us. So here are some rules that we've developed. When you're working with NGOs and charities and non-governmental organizations, you can ask, do they accept the leadership and thinking of disabled people's organizations? Or do they just do an odd consultation with us? There's a big difference between those. Do they do everything they can to empower and build the capacity of their DPOs? Often DPOs have been underfunded and don't have the capacity. Many of the international organizations such as HI or Leonard Cheshire or Save the Children, Inclusion International, many of these have large amounts of money and can actually help to develop our capacity. Inclusion International is really a DPO because it's parents and people with learning difficulties, so maybe not them, but other organizations certainly are there. Do they reject the charity medical model in favor of a social human rights model? And are they good allies supporting us in that struggle? Do they put the organizational, financial and training resources of their organization at the disposal of DPOs? And if the charity provides welfare services and treatment, do they still empower disabled people they work with, such as Sight Savers? Sight Savers do a lot of human rights work, but they also provide a lot of provision for people with failing sight and so on. And I'm not sure those two parts are connected in every case. Do they allow disabled people and their organizations to lead? Remember, nothing about us without us. Or do they steal our clothes? The feeling on this was so strong that the UK Foreign Commonwealth Development Office did a consultation last year and the year before, which we took part in, of DPOs, and the view came across very strongly that we felt that the money should be coming directly to us as DPOs to actually develop our own rights-based approaches, and that too much of it was being channeled to supposedly safe pairs of hands. Our answer to that is develop our capacity, help us to hold grants, help us to develop the capacity to program manage so that we can bring about real change. Because, you know, even with the best will in the world, most of these large DPOs do not employ disabled people in a majority, and they don't take account of us in their ruling body. So that's one area that we have to be worried about. It's a subset, if you like, of a much wider model, the medical model of disability, which has developed really in the last 300 years since a scientific approach has been taken to material things. And the extension of that was to explore the universe and the world, but also to explore inside the human body with dissections and other things. It was not that long ago that people didn't realize that blood was pumped round the body by the heart. That's less than 300 years ago that Harvey discovered the general circulation. Any child anywhere really now will tell you that the heart pumps blood around the body, 3-year-old. So we have come a long way in understanding our body and how it works. But unfortunately, with that and the Hippocratic Oath to cure and help people has led to this idea that disabled people need to be made whole, to be seen through the medical lens and be altered in such a way that they become, quote, normal. Well, there are no normal people. There are a whole range of different people who are around. And really what we're saying as people with impairments who comprise the disabled people's movement, get used to it. We've been around ever since human beings are there. We now do not wish to be treated as second-class citizens. We need the adjustments that we need and the support we need, including medical support. We're not against medical support. We just don't want to be seen solely through our impairments. So this led about 50 to 60 years ago to a big change that we talked about in that transition at the beginning, to the social model approach, which recognizes the need to change people's thinking about disabled people, to alter the environment to make it accessible for us, to transform organizations and their policies and practices and procedures to include us, and urgently to counter the low esteem and poor self-attitudes by empowering disabled people to insist upon their rights. Because after all, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we've been on the receiving end of negative attitudes, and the people in the white coats know best. And this, of course, became a crunch issue as the development of the international disability movement occurred. And this focus of the shift, altering disabled people so that they fit in, away from that to looking at the barriers and transforming society, is the core of that. And perhaps the first organization, though by no means the only one that did this, was an organization called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, which started meeting in the 1970s. There were similar upsurges in Zimbabwe, Malaysia, India, lots of places, Sweden, Canada, and people began to think of a different way of looking at things. And Upias said, we don't want to be treated as patients for the whole of our lives. We want to be able to live in the community with the right support. And where we need medical support, we want it, but we don't want to be just labeled as in need of medical support. And some of those people, together with a lot of other people, went to a conference in 1980, which was UN Year of the Disabled, and an organization largely medical based, so with those medical model views, Rehabilitation International, held a conference in Winnipeg in 1980. About 300 delegates from the growing new disability movement that was taking this new model, the social model, put up a motion at that conference that at least 50% of the board, nothing about us without us, should be disabled people. That was rejected by Rehabilitation International, and all those delegates walked out of that conference and held a side meeting to say, we're going to found a new disabled people's-led cross-impairment organization, which was founded the following year. And they'd held a conference in between where they adopted definitions of what they meant by disability. And what DPI, which was founded in Singapore in 1981, adopted, impairment, on the one hand, is the loss or limitation of physical, mental, or sensory function on a long-term or permanent basis. And I said it's been part of human existence all the way through. However, disability is the loss or limitation of opportunity to take part in the normal or ordinary life of the community on an equal level with others, not because of our impairments, but due to physical and social barriers. That was a fundamental change, and it was where it came from, the change that we're talking about. So fast forward 25 years, and in 2006, the United Nations agrees the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Didn't quite get the language right, but they did get the sentiment right. And in the preamble to that, it says in that agreement, recognize that disability is an evolving concept and that disability results from the interaction of persons with impairments, not people with disability, persons with impairments, and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. That's pretty close to that DPI definition. So how do we get from a few hundred people in a room in 1981 to the world agreeing a convention which now covers 1.3 billion people around the world with a human rights treaty? So let's take another clip here, and from Thandi, who's a long-running member of our executive from Disabled People South Africa, and we'll be interested in how she talks about these barriers as the issue. Thank you.
Let me talk about barriers, okay? We've got barriers of attitude, like I was saying. And also as ourselves as disabled people and as organization of disabled people, we work in silos. But if we work as a collective, all of us having one voice and a human rights voice, then we will be listened to. Another thing that is a barrier, in our country, we've got policies that protect us, but the implementation side of it is a zero. Assistive devices are still expensive. It's a barrier. If I don't have a wheelchair, I won't be able to move. Only the few can afford that, those who are rich, who can afford. I'm talking about barriers in terms of policies that are not being followed. Every health department knows they must budget, but they don't do that. We are also disabled by the environment, by the society. There's cultural beliefs, you know, albinos are killed in our country because they believe that they will be lucky. That is a cultural issue. Education. When you're disabled, even if the school is in front of you, you won't be able to go to that school because you need a special school. Instead of Department of Education saying, make sure that every school that is built is accessible. And we've got a Built Environment Act. It's there that everything should be accessible, but there's no enforcement. Another thing that is a barrier in South Africa is a race. We talk democracy, we talk that South Africa is free. For disabled people, South Africa is not free. Because we are still being serviced according to your color. You still go to school. All majority, 90% of white children with disability are at school, compared to 90% of black children who are not at school.
So thank you, Thandui. So what we've learned from this so far is that we reject the old traditional views. We've rejected the charity extension of that, and we reject the medical focus on us. And what we want is a social model human rights approach. And one of the key tools for people to learn about this is to identify the barriers in your local area, in your home, in your school, in your college, in your community. And so I would like everyone on the course to practice doing this and think about the area you live in and think about your own impairment and maybe one or two different impairments, someone with intellectual or learning difficulty or autism, someone with a sensory impairment or someone with a physical impairment. Take 3 of those so you get a range of experience and look at the environment, look at the attitudes, look at the organizations, including employment and government, schools and so on, and identify some of the barriers that those people face, not because of their impairment, but because of the way things are organized. You can do this with post-it notes, which you just make a grid with squares, or you can do it, whichever way you want, make a little table and identify the barriers, as many as you can. Then once you've done that, start thinking about how you might change those to make it more inclusive for those different disabled people without a huge amount of expenditure, though there may be some for technology and other things. And I think that's a very useful way of learning how to do it. And then once you've got those solutions, you can make an action plan, putting them on a timeline when you can do various things. So the attitudinal changes will take time, but you can start doing those straight away. Changing the buildings will take more time to plan, or what's in the buildings, making adjustments. You can have easy, reasonable accommodations and then more high-tech ones, which will take more resource. So you can make a little action plan for wherever your sphere of activity is. So let's now hear from Emil, who's another one of our executive members. He leads for underrepresented groups and is himself someone with autism, and he's talking about this issue.
When you look at persons with intellectual impairments, learning difficulties, and also persons of short stature, but also more importantly, when you think about how we can accommodate those individuals, we need to look at the reasonable accommodations, what we can do in order to include those individuals in society, following a social model in terms of how these individuals can participate, by how they can communicate, put systems in place to build their self-confidence, and also give solidarity as well, in order for those individuals to represent themselves and their community personally and also on a high political level.
So thank you, Emil. Reinforcing really what Thandi said, but I think the more we get this idea across. So what actually happened from 81 to 2006? Well, we had the Disabled People International. We were already existing organizations for the blind and deaf-blind that had been going for quite a long time. In fact, these single impairment organizations were set up around 100 years ago, many of them, and they did do a lot of bargaining for individual impairment groups, such that, postage is free for blind people around the world, that the money in many places around the world is of different sizes and different shapes, so that blind people can actually do it. That means a powerful lobby group was lobbying for that group, but that was just who they were, a lobby group for one particular group. Whereas what we found with DPI, that the most important thing was to be cross impairment, to actually look at the different impairment groups and work out how we can work together, how we can learn to sign so that deaf people can be part of it. And the role of the DPOs in building up national umbrella groups that combine people with different impairments was a really important growth process that happened in the 80s and 90s, that we got to 150 national councils of representative of various groups within the country. And those councils are by and large our key members now in the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. We have nearly 50 of them in membership, plus associate members. So it's really important that you join and participate in those organizations. And if they're not habitable for you, you need to start making demands why younger people need to be there, that people with your type and degree of needs should be met, and so on. Because doing all of that meant that we were able to bring a caucus together at the United Nations once Mexico had asked for there to be a debate, and a committee was set up in 2001. Delegates from countries, but also delegates from DPOs and NGOs were able to come to that. And we built up over the 8 meetings to there being a majority, really, of disabled people activists there, framing what the Human Rights Treaty should be. Now, of course, human rights had come about in the wake of the Second World War, with the 50 million people killed and the terrible displacement. People began to argue there needed to be a universal declaration of human rights, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the just deceased president, was key in both setting up the declaration and getting the United Nations set up. And the early countries to the United Nations all agreed this declaration. And it doesn't mention disability, but it does mention women, children, ethnic minorities, and other groups. So we were, and other groups, right through the 60s and 70s, where there were conventions also made for social and economic rights and political, cultural rights, particularly on the social and economic rights, this concept of progressive realization that you brought it in as and when you could afford it. But the political and cultural rights come in straight away. And that is a fact for the 188 countries now that have adopted the UN Convention. Those political and cultural rights become a right from the moment that they do ratify the convention. And indeed, they should do nothing against it, even when they haven't ratified. They've just said they intend to ratify. And the core of these human rights is that they are inherent. So everybody has them. They're indivisible. So you can't say, well, I'll have that one, but not that one. They're inalienable, so they can't be taken away for any reason. They're universal. They apply to everybody. If you're alive and a human being, you have human rights. It was said that there would be no new rights in this treaty, but inevitably, looking at the needs of disabled people, the slant that was given in the convention, and it's worth your while having a read of these articles so that you familiarize yourself with them. There are plenty of places you can do that. But for instance, the right to reasonable accommodation was not something that was in other previous human rights declarations, a previous 10 of them that had been made. The right for women was in CEDAW, but not for disabled women. And our disabled women members tell us, who are very strong, that they don't get welcomed into women's fora. They don't see that disabled women are part of that. And similarly for children, Article 7, the progressive realization for children wasn't there in the same way as the rights were when the rights of the child were made in 1989. Segregation was seen as okay. It's not seen as okay in this treaty. Accessibility as a new human right. This was not a human right before. It is now a human right in Article 9. Emergencies, thinking about disabled people in all emergency situations and epidemics such as COVID, was something new for many governments, and we had to push them very hard to do that. Capacity building, the right to have legal capacity in Article 12, and the right to assisted decision-making. This is still something that most countries are resilient to. And many psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on are against it. Independent living, Article 19, the right to live in the community with supports. This was a new right, effectively. Rehabilitation, elevated to a right, that you got the right support so you could maximize what you could do in society. The right to education, being inclusive education, as it is now defined, was a new right, and most countries are not keeping up with this. The right to equal health treatment was not something we'd experienced, and the right to open market employment, not separate and segregated employment under Article 27, and the right to equal political involvement in 29. And then in DPO involvement in Article 4.3 and 33.3, our right as DPOs to be consulted and be involved, and therefore, if we're to function, governments need to pay for us, is something we are still campaigning on. Implementing this UNCRPD is something you need to familiarize yourself. There is a committee elected by the state parties that meets every year, and they elect half of the committee every 2 years. and they oversee reports from all the state signatories. They're somewhat behind, but they've caught up quite a long way. And they also produce general comment reports where they bring together all their experiences. And these general comment reports are really worth reading. You can get all of them on the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, CRPD committee website, and really worth looking at. So we have decided as the CRPD that we're not going to distinguish between the social model and human rights. The social model is the vehicle that mobilizes us as disabled people and fights for our rights, and we still need to do that. The human rights model gives those rights to everybody and goes beyond the social model, but without us as the motor to make that happen, without that as the motor to implement those rights, they won't get implemented. So now I'd like to hear from Skada, a second contribution from her. Thank you.
So I think the human rights model or the social model is very important for disabled people because it liberates them and gives them power to advocate for their rights in a more structured and in a more powerful manner. Previously, when we had the medical model, it was disempowering for disabled people to even speak out and share their concerns and be subjects and be participants of the development of their countries because it wasn't empowering. But the human rights model gives us power and gives us, liberates us from all the social injustices that we've been encountering as disabled people.
So just to wind up then, we set out a big agenda for you as the beginning of this course. We'd like you to follow up on some of the activities. Once you've viewed this film, there is also some notes which will be up on the website as well with some follow-up activities. I've mentioned 2 of them. There are a couple of more there which we would strongly urge you to do so that you actually understand these concepts. And then you will get questions that you can send to the email address that you will be sent for your regional group discussion, which will take place in the last week of the month. And in those group discussions, points that you're not sure about or you want further clarification can be raised, and your mentors, each region will have 3 mentors, will be able to deal with those issues there. So thanks very much for listening to this first module of the course.